Hi, everybody. Welcome back. It's Mrs. Firth here to talk to you today about the Restoration period, also known as the Neoclassical period, or also known as the Enlightenment. It's from the time period of about 1660 to 1800. We call it the Restoration first and foremost, and that's what I'll usually be referring to it as in class because it's about the time period after the monarchy was restored in England. And I'll tell you in just a moment what it was restored from. We also call it the neoclassical period because it's the time period in which the artists and writers and thinkers of the time focused on ancient Greek and ancient Roman architecture, design, philosophy, and ideas, which you can see to this day in the architecture in, for example, Washington, D.C., a city that was conceived of, designed, and implemented in the late neoclassical period. And they also call it the Enlightenment period because this is the time period that people thought, you know what, it might be that alchemy is a waste of our time. And so they started focusing their human abilities on science and math, which we'll talk about with the Royal Society later in this lecture. But so roughly we're talking about the second half of the 17th century and all of the 18th century. It's a long time period. We'll spend about 6 weeks on it in class. And this fellow to the right of the screen here, King Charles II, as it says in the caption, is the first monarch to rule in England following the restoration of the monarchy to power. And you can tell by looking at him that he wants you to know how powerful he is. He wants you to know how much luxury he can afford, that no expense has been spared. He's got the silk-lined velvet cloak cape that is obviously huge and extraordinarily long. He's got, the crown at his arm on the table. He's got all of these sashes and the ribbons and the medals and the looks like a bungee cord or something that would hold back your curtains, but I believe that's the cord that indicated which order he was in with his nobility, kind of like identifying which fraternity he was in. The cords that you wear with your graduation robes are a callback to that old tradition. And if you'll note, he's also wearing very tight leggings, kind of looks like an acid wash jegging, really. And that's to show off his masculine and shapely calves, which was a hot fashion feature of the Restoration era, as was a big, luxurious head of hair. And then, of course, on his feet, he's wearing some diamond buckle boots. It looks like he borrowed from Prince, which was also a really popular fashion feature for men in the Restoration era to wear high-heeled boots. But, he learned all that fashion from his daddy, which we'll get to in just a moment. All right, so what happened was that Elizabeth I left no heirs during the Renaissance era. And so that meant that her first cousin, James VI, the King of Scotland, assumed the throne in England. And that made a lot of people angry in England. The idea that they would be ruled by a Scottish king was outrageous to them. He became James the First once he became King of England because there had never been an English king named James before. So he was James the Sixth in Scotland, James the First in England. He was a chill kind of dude, but he had some wacky ideas at the time that really upset people. For example, he wanted to unite Scotland and Ireland with England into one kingdom, into something like, I don't know, the United Kingdom. That could never happen. But the main problem for James VI was that he considered monarchs to be little gods on earth, essentially demigods, and he ruled as such. He didn't consult Parliament, he didn't ask for advice, and he did what he wanted to do. That didn't go over well with a lot of people with power. And then ultimately, the thing that he did that upset the most people was marry a Catholic. the French princess Henrietta. And this was a time period in which it was illegal to be Catholic in England, and there were lots of Catholics hiding their Catholicism on the down low and risking imprisonment and worse for their Catholic faith. And then all of a sudden, the Queen gets to be Catholic, but nobody else does. That did not go over well. But his attitude was, look, God chose me to be king. I make my decisions, and if you don't like it, you can suck a pickle. And so, as you might imagine, he made some enemies. And then his son, Charles I, was just like his father. And after 2 generations, it finally led to the English Civil War. This is Charles I over on the left-hand side of the screen here. And you can see that Charles II picked up a lot of his father's fashion sense. I tend to call them pimps. Anyway, look at his shoes here. He's got a golden pom-pom on each of his high-heeled shoes. He's got velvet cloaks with ermine robes and linings and lace collars, and he's got that razor point, highly groomed goatee, exactly like John Donne had. And, you know, he cut quite the fashionable figure, as his son did as well. But ultimately, this kind of behavior drove the Puritans out of their minds. When you look at this picture of Charles I, you are looking at a man who stood for everything that the Puritans loathed. They were as if they were negative images of each other. And so that's what prompted the Puritans to finally wage full-on war with their countrymen. And the leader of the Puritans was this guy on the left here, Oliver Cromwell. And when I talk about the Restoration, I'm talking about the time period after the Cromwellian rule was put down. He personally only ruled for about 5 years, and then his son had a few after that. I can't remember the exact amount of time that the Cromwells ruled, but it was 10-ish years around there. The Puritans were also known as the New Model Army or the Roundheads, and the Royalists, people who were loyal to the crown, were the Cavaliers. In modern day American parlance, we might say that the Puritans were kind of like the religious right, and the Royalists were more like the establishment liberals. Although Cavalier, of course, has the prefix in it, caval, which comes from like cavalry or cavalcade. And a cavalier was, you know, someone who was brave and willing to rush into the fight ahead of everyone else and, you know, damn the torpedoes. They were going to take all risks. And the Cavalier poets, we'll read later this week, identified themselves as royalists who supported the monarchy, who supported the establishment and the status quo in England. Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the Puritans, used this painting that I've given you a really close-up view of to help establish how he was different from the status quo in England. Just by something as small as this blemish here. Supposedly, when Cromwell sat for this painting, he told the portrait artist to portray him exactly as he was, warts and all. He did not want to have any vanity enter into the portraiture. And if you look at these previous pictures, you can tell that Charles I and Charles II were not the kind of men who would allow their warts to be painted. But Cromwell absolutely was. He wanted to be a man of the people. He lived a much plainer life than these gilded lilies of the monarchs that he followed. And he wanted to be a man of the people, first and foremost. However, it didn't work out that way exactly. He turned England into the English Commonwealth, and then he conquered Ireland and Scotland and brought them all together under one umbrella as the Protectorate. And the irony, of course, is that's what James and Charles I and Charles II later wanted. But they told James the First that that was craziness, that it could never happen. But that's exactly what Cromwell did once he got power. And then, after he executed Charles the First by chopping off his head, he became the supreme leader of the English Commonwealth and was known as the Lord Protector. And that did not go over well with a lot of members of the New Model Army, because they felt that they had fought to tear down a monarchy, and Cromwell had just installed himself as a new dictator monarch. And using the title Lord as if he were a member of the nobility was a problem. However, he was so charismatic and such a good leader, they let him get away with it. However, when he died in 1658, somewhat unexpectedly, his youngest son died, and according to people writing at the time, he just kind of gave up on life, died of a broken heart, as they say. But his oldest son, Richard Cromwell, took over, and Richard Cromwell apparently was aptly named, um, because one of the more famous nicknames for Richard seemed to apply to him. No one liked him. He did not have the confidence of the army, and furthermore, people were outraged that the new leader of the Puritan government would be automatically the son of the previous leader, because if that's not a monarchy, what is? And so everything blew up, and the royalists took their opportunity and they sent a boat to The Hague to pick up Charles II. The Hague is like a political region of the Netherlands, kind of like the Washington, D.C. of the Netherlands. And Charles II had fled the country around the time they executed his father, and he was fairly young. And when they went to get him in The Hague, he was living in dire conditions. He was dirty, he was starving, he was, his hair was matted up, he was in bad, bad shape. And once he reclaimed the throne in 1660, all bets were off. The parties were on. There was no stopping the luxurious life that he wanted to lead. It was a legendary time for excess in the palace. Okay, so that's the era that we're talking about. The era that Charles II takes the throne is the Restoration period. It's crazy excess. It's joy that life can go back to the way things were, because the Puritans, frankly, while being full of good ideas, were not a whole lot of fun. And fun was back in a big way. It was a long Mardi Gras, more or less, after Charles II reclaimed the throne. Okay, but it only lasted for about 5 years, because in 1666, a giant fire known as the Great Fire of London burned down the majority of the city, two-thirds of it, and it killed one-sixth of the inhabitants. If you look at this map here, the black line is supposed to, the black line is supposed to represent the it's not the Great Wall, but the Wall of London that surrounded the medieval city. This is supposed to be the Tower of London. This is most of the historical part of London, and this is sort of kind of the suburbs at the time. But everything that's in orange here burned to the ground. Everything. It was utter devastation. This blue cross here in the center is supposed to represent St. Paul's Cathedral, the religious center of the city. It also burned to the ground. But on the plus side, that fire, which wiped out most of London, helped to end the Black Plague that came to London in 1665, which is an extraordinary visitation of the illness, the last great plague to come to Western Europe, and perhaps not the most virulent case of it, but close. And so London went through some things. Charles II went through some things. He threw a lot of great parties, but he also inherited some incredible problems to deal with as the leader of a country that was suffering mightily. And about that plague I was talking about, this is a famous illustration. It's German, actually, not English, but it's an illustration of how plague doctors dressed. And essentially, this mask was an antiquated form of a gas mask. It was stuffed with aromatic items such as amber, mint leaves, cloves, camphor, laudanum, myrrh, and rose petals, aka potpourri, because people believed in the miasma theory at the time. They believed that bad smells spread disease. And if you could wear a mask like this that had like potpourri stuffed in the end, that would prevent you from smelling the rot of illness and disease. And so that would protect you from getting it. They also wore, of course, gloves. They also wore long leather boots under their coats, and that helped to protect them from disease. They thought no touching would help. The stick they carried was for poking the body with the stick instead of actually touching it with their fingers. Now, this probably did help protect the plague doctors, but not for the reasons that they thought. Of course, now we know that the plague is spread by flea bites, and by having all of their skin covered, that probably helped them by not allowing them to get fleas on their skin. Of course, fleas could have traveled in their robes back to their homes and, you know, jumped on them as they changed clothes, but it was more effective than nothing, I suppose. But this nightmarish image still influences some art and films. You'll see people wearing masks like this in Carnival in Brazil. You'll see it at Mardi Gras, and you'll see it in horror movies. I'm not sure what about it is so creepy to us, even when we don't know what it is, but it is pretty creepy. It's pretty creepy. Okay, now a big part of why this is called the Enlightenment period is because in this period, Western European thinking shifted from why to how, because people used to believe that terrible natural events preceded human tragedy. In Hamlet, this happened. This idea that if something supernatural occurred, like a ghost appearing, or if there was a terrible storm and a bunch of trees fell down, that was a suggestion that something terrible was happening with the king, that the king had made a mistake, or someone had made an attempt on the king's life, or something like that. So if an earthquake happened, they would try to look for causes in human behavior as to what might have caused the earthquake as a punishment from God. But during the Enlightenment, people began to think about how things happened instead. Instead of, you know, why the earthquake happened, what had we done to deserve it, they began to wonder how the earthquake actually occurred. Now, earthquake is an example. People weren't doing great work in the tectonic plate industry, well, it's not an industry, but tectonic plate field during the Restoration period. It's just an example of a natural phenomenon that would have interested them. Famously, Ben Franklin was really interested in lightning. He wanted to know how it worked, what it did, and instead of viewing lightning as, you know, a way that God meted out justice on earth, he wanted to know how to use it for something useful. And had Ben Franklin been British, I feel pretty confident he would have been a member of the Royal Society, which was formed during Charles II's reign. And it was formed to support such scientists and inventors as Isaac Newton. You've heard of him, all those laws of physics. Ben Franklin, as I said, Charles Babbage, James Cook, Charles Darwin. Charles Babbage, of course, invented the first computer, which is basically a giant calculator. James Cook was an intrepid explorer. Charles Darwin, of course, with evolution, all the way up to Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking is a member of the Royal Society today. And we will hear more about that with our Samuel Pepys unit. He was the secretary for the Royal Society. Okay, there were also big changes in religious ideas going on during this time period, as well as scientific ideas. And this was the period in which deism became a very popular philosophy for thinkers to adopt. This was the prevalent religious ideology of American founding fathers, but it was also the prevalent religious ideology of most members of the Royal Society and a lot of the thinkers in Great Britain during the Restoration period as well. I believe it was Isaac Newton who made the metaphor that they believed that God was like a clockmaker who set the earth ticking and then moved on to other projects. They believed that, you know, the earth, like a terrarium, was something that God had put together and put humans in it, and that God had provided everything on earth that humans needed to be happy. As a matter of fact, Ben Franklin famously said that beer was proof that God loved us and wanted us to be happy, because it was something, you can't say that God made beer, but God gave humans the ability and the rough materials to make beer with. And so that was proof of deism, more or less, to them. They believed that it was up to you to determine the course of your life and to pursue happiness, as we see in our founding documents in America. But deists did not believe that God was watching your every move and was actively involved in your day to day life. Deists did not focus on this idea that God had a plan for you and, was seeing you through. Deists felt like God made you, God gave you, a starter kit, and now it was up to you to do the work, and God had moved on to other projects. This, of course, is a radically different idea than, say, Chaucer had in the Middle Ages. And a lot of deists still consider themselves to be Christian, but they had a very different take on Christianity than a lot of Christianities from before them and even after them. Thomas Jefferson famously was a deist, and there was at some point some discussion of how he wanted to have a Bible that was nothing but the words of Christ and all the rest of it gone. That was a very deist attitude. Okay, so changes in science, changes in religion, and then we also had significant economic changes during the Restoration period. See if any of this sounds familiar. During this period, the middle class grew significantly. The middle class had begun building during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, but of course, the rich got richer because they always do, and the poor got miserable because they always do. But at this point, there was an economic system in Great Britain that was very similar to what we see happening in America today, in which, a huge portion of the wealth in the country is concentrated among a very small number of people. And, hundreds of millions of us share, a much smaller amount. So anyway, in the bold text here, I've listed the classes according to Jonathan Swift. This was how he saw the differences between the classes. And he believed first they had the great who lived profusely. The great would have been people in the upper echelons of the nobility in Great Britain during this time period. These are people who would have several mansions in, several countries. In America, our equivalent would be like, Mitt Romney, even. He famously has a number of houses across the country, as does Oprah and Bill Gates. But then you have people who were just the rich, who live plentifully. Low end members of the nobility would have just been regular rich. Here in Atlanta, if you want to see just regular rich people, just go to, West Paces Ferry, go to Buckhead. You'll see a lot of standard rich people. Not Oprah rich, but rich enough. And then you have the middle sort who live well. A lot of people who go to our school are from the middle sort. They live in regular houses. You can look around the neighborhood, around the school. It's a middle sort kind of school. But then you have the working trades who labor hard but feel no want. Now we call this the working class. People who live in little houses, people who live in apartments. And although that's not always true in cities, sometimes city apartments are far more expensive than houses. But in rural areas, they would live in apartments and or a small house in the city. But then there are also country people or farmers, etc., who fare indifferently, meaning they don't really need currency or need to interact with the economy very often because they completely fare for themselves. They make their own clothes, they grow their own food, they slaughter their own hogs, and they live in a cottage out in the woods, and so they're apart from the rest of us. Then there are the poor that fare hard. These are people who live in shacks. These are people who live in housing that would have been condemned. Unfortunately, this happens in Atlanta fairly often. I saw a news story not too long ago about a condominium complex in Clarkson that had been condemned for 10 years and people were still living there. And then you have the miserable, people that really pinch and suffer want, as Swift would have said. And we're talking about the homeless there. We're talking about people who would freeze to death in the winter. We're talking about people that you see at I-85 and Claremont living under the bridge in the tent community. So all of these classes are still very much alive and well in modern America and modern Great Britain today. And during this time period, writers started to focus on the glaring contrast between the various classes. Shakespeare, for example, wrote almost exclusively about the upper classes. When you saw the lower classes in Shakespeare's work, they were often clown characters, like the gravedigger, for example, or Osric at the end was a joke because he was trying to crawl up to a new class. And this is still a major issue in England and elsewhere. India famously has a caste system. Every country has caste systems. They just might not call it that. And a lot of people look to America and believe that America is different because there is mobility in between our classes, that you can move up in America. And that's just not true everywhere. And it might be a bit of a myth in America, but I'm sure you talked about that with The Great Gatsby last year in your 11th grade class. Anyway, satire evolved in England during this time period because of this class warfare and the stereotypes about people who are poor and about people who are rich. And it was very dangerous to criticize the great and the rich. They were politically powerful, and if you criticized them directly, you could wind up in shackles. But with satire, if it was a joke, then how could people take it seriously? You could always say you were kidding. And so people figured out how to use satire very eloquently to drive their point home and to criticize people who had more power than they did. We'll see this most particularly with Jonathan Swift in this unit. Okay, the Restoration also saw new art forms develop. The Restoration shut down theater, and so that great period of drama in the Renaissance kind of ended. Because drama was over for 18 years, people got out of the game, and when drama was back, it wasn't very good. It was bawdy, which means like it was raunchy. Censorship was over. People took it a little too far. Restoration comedies were kind of like American Pie movies. They were silly. They were full of stupid jokes, sex jokes, fart jokes, just think of something that would make, the average 15-year-old laugh, and then you're thinking about Restoration comedy. Now, I know you're saying, then why aren't we reading it? It sounds awesome. But it's not really. It's just silly. If you've seen American Pie, you've seen Restoration comedy. It's not worth making you read it. And of course, poetry was a really big deal in this unit. We'll be reading a good bit of poetry. I know you've had your fill of John Donne already, who was a precursor to the Restoration period, but we'll be moving into the Cavalier poets this week, which you're sure to enjoy more than you think you will. But most importantly, during this period, people started writing novels, which was a new art form. And now it's, one of the most respected literary art forms. But at the time, people thought it was trashy. They thought it was like, the equivalent of a reality show now. Like, why would you read a novel? That's, for dumb people who just need ways to waste time. But some of the novels written during this time period are still highly respected and well read, like Robinson Crusoe, which inspired, Swiss Family Robinson. If you've read that, there was a TV show on NBC about 6 or 7 years ago called Crusoe. It only lasted one season, but still, it inspires people. His Gal Friday is a reference to Robinson Crusoe. And then, of course, Gulliver's Travels, which was a Jack Black movie a couple of years ago. You actually have seen a lot of things from Gulliver's Travels and you didn't realize it because it was so influential. We'll be reading a big chunk of that in this unit as well. Okay, the end of the Restoration came around the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, around 1800, because the Industrial Revolution came, and that restructured the economy once again. The French Revolution came, which was scary for the nobility and devastating for the intellectuals in England at the time. And everybody got really tired of focusing on the rich. They got tired of the class battle. They got tired of, trying to focus on elegance, reason, and taste and pretend like we're all ancient Greeks and ancient Romans and hey, have you read the latest Sophocles or whatever? That just seemed silly in the face of the major social upheaval that came at the end of the Restoration period. We'll talk about this again when we move on to the Romantic period. And here are the titles that we will read during this unit. We'll read To His Coy Mistress by Andrew Marvell, To the Virgins to Make Much of Time by Robert Herrick, and we'll count John Donne here, but he's really Renaissance era, as I've said, but he was such a major influence in the Cavalier poets, Marvell and Herrick in particular, that it's important to note. We'll read Gulliver's Travels, as I said, and we'll also read informational texts in this unit and do a project, a nonfiction writing project, and, I'm sure you're really going to enjoy it, even though you think you're not now. We're going to read A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift, which is both satire and economics. We're going to read A Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe and The Diary of Samuel Pepys by, of course, Samuel Pepys, which are primary and secondary sources about the same topic, and we'll talk about how historians use historical documents and move them forward. So lots of really interesting stuff in this unit, even though it's a long unit and it sounds terrible. I promise you're going to enjoy it. It's way more interesting than you think. There were a lot of awful things happening during this time period, but the one positive that you can always take from major social upheaval is that it changes people, and I think it makes them better. And so that will be one of the points of focus that we'll have over this unit. All right, thanks you guys for tuning in, and get ready for that pop quiz.